the On Love and How to Find It tutorial, episode 2, The Encounter. If you are joining us for the very first time, welcome to our global learning community. This is going to be a 1-hour live lecture / tutorial in which we talk about various philosophical theories of love, and we try to implement them in a way that is hopefully enriching and valuable to you. My name is Julian, and I'm also very glad to say that we have back with us today. Do you want to come over to this side? Jeneline.
We're not in the car anymore, so I have to walk over.
Jeneline, who has returned from the Canadian yoga retreat, healthy, zenful, mindful, spiritually enlightened, not eaten by a bear, thank goodness.
Yes.
So we're very glad to have Jeneline back. And before we jump in, I just want to do a very quick plug, which is that my ebook, which is called
The Useless Precaution.
The Useless Precaution, thank you very much, is now available exclusively on Patreon. It's an ebook introduction to the works of Zizek and Lacan. It's a very Lacanian ebook. In fact, we have a chapter called The Dream of Many Penises, which I think you'll enjoy. Basically, it's 107 pages of pure Lacanian Zizekian goodness. And it's based on the lecture series that I taught before this lecture series on love. So if you'd like to check that out, that is available exclusively on Patreon, available right now. We posted it a couple of hours ago. Plus, if you sign up today, you will be able to get 2 ebooks for the price of 1, because you will also get the ebook from the previous lecture series thrown in for free. So that's going to be 5 Keys to Zizek, plus the Useless Precaution, which you can download right away. I'm super excited about it. Like, I honestly, Jeneline and I were talking about this. We think this is the best book that we've produced yet. We're really proud of it. It just, I don't know, it's just a pure encapsulation of the kind of vibe that we try to send out to you every single week.
Well, it was an amazing couple weeks of travel. You don't have to turn. They know what I look like. It was an amazing couple weeks of travel, and I think that really informed a lot of the lectures. And I want to say, if you are joining us from another country, another place, let us know in the comments where you are joining us from. As Julian mentioned, I just got back from Canada.
That's right, yeah. One of the best things about doing this, hosting these Introduction to Philosophy and Theory classes, is that we are joined by students from around the world. So please do leave us a comment letting us know where you're joining us from. Makes us very happy. It's like, that is the ultimate gift you can give us. And for those of you asking what the title of the book is, the title of the book is The Useless Precaution, and it is available exclusively for our patrons. You can download it today. And someone says, I've noticed Julian has a huge Indian audience. Indeed, we can talk about this more on Discord, but the Instagram algorithm sent our videos out to a lot of Indian viewers within the last week. So welcome to all of our new viewers from India and Pakistan, I see. Yeah, okay. Thank you guys. So please do leave a comment letting us know where you're joining us from. It makes me very, very happy. It is genuinely the thing that I love the most about this project. I see Slovenia, I see South Africa, the United States. We are a genuinely global community of learners. Iran, that's incredible. And yes, the book is called The Useless Precaution. It's an introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis and Zizek's take on Lacan. You can find it exclusively on Patreon. But for now, this is going to be an introductory lecture. So I see someone from Holland as well, the Netherlands. That's wonderful. Okay, I need to not be distracted because it's so nice seeing where people are joining us from. Okay, this is going to be episode 2 in our new tutorial lecture series on love and how to find it, on various philosophical theories of love. And today we're going to talk about the encounter. Last week's class was titled The Third Thing. This one is the encounter. Now, the third thing was an idea that Brecht had in a poem, that to sustain love over time, whether it's between a couple or between a parent and a child, you need to have something more than love. You need to have a shared project, an idea, a vision, a commitment. And you have to find that thing that nurtures you within a relationship over time. But today we're going to talk about the encounter, because I got a couple messages from people with a very valid complaint saying, Julian, all of this talk about love is good and well, but how do we find it? Well, my response to that is that it's not so much that you find love, it's that love finds you. And today we're going to talk about the manner in which love finds you and what that entails, and some of the pitfalls and some of the dangers that come with that kind of encounter with love. And so today's class is going to be called The Encounter, episode 2 in our tutorial on love and how to find it. And anybody can join. This is for beginners. But if you'd like to download every single tutorial as a podcast to listen to on your own time, do know that as a patron, you have access to exclusive digital downloads for every single class. That includes transcripts, that includes a bonus podcast in which we take your questions and answer them, and that includes full audio for every single lecture. So we are recording this right now so that our patrons can listen to it after the fact. That being said, if you're joining us live on Instagram, I'm so grateful that you're here and I hope that you stick around. I can't believe how many people are here in the live. That is just absolutely incredible. It makes me so happy. Okay, so if you look behind me, you're gonna see a little bit of a hint. Actually, it's not in frame, as to what this class is gonna start with. You may recognize this familiar character here. I'm very proud of this toy, this collectible. Okay, I want to start with Miyazaki's theory of love, because I think it's very interesting. It's quite philosophically profound. Hayao Miyazaki, the director and animator of films such as My Neighbor Totoro, Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, I'm sure you have your own favorite. And Miyazaki's theory of love works like this. He says that love is an encounter, and it's a seemingly traumatic encounter. And this is actually the key moment in almost all of Miyazaki's films. It's an encounter with somebody who is completely other to you. Someone who suddenly takes you out of your subjective experience. And quite literally, within most of Miyazaki's movies, there's a scene in which an encounter with somebody else, usually someone from the opposite sex, fundamentally disrupts and distorts the protagonist's point of view. In this sense, for Miyazaki, he's very close to Zizek, that love is not something that is just, you're plucking the petals off of a flower saying, does she love me, does she not? It's not a narcissistic attachment. Instead, it's almost the exact other way around. It's saying, I was fine, and suddenly I had this flash, this encounter, and my life is no longer the same. And think about, for example, I'll give you an example of this. In Princess Mononoke, perhaps the most stunning cinematic depiction of this is when the protagonist witnesses Princess Mononoke from a distance drinking at the river together with the wolf. And for one moment, their eyes lock between the protagonist and what he thought was the antagonist, which now appears to be the love interest. And in that locking of eyes, that intermingling of souls, we have a moment that is so earth-shatteringly, life-changingly disruptive that the entire narrative of the movie, good versus evil, is disrupted. And Miyazaki has always said that for him, what constitutes the tension within a plot is not whether good can fight evil, but precisely whether there can be this disruption in which you realize the good within evil and the evil within good. This is where Miyazaki's theory of love is actually very close to Hegel's theory of evil. Hegel says that there is no such thing as good versus evil, the good guys versus the bad guys. The philosopher Hegel actually cautions that the most evil thing you can do is to think of the world as being a battle between good and evil. That the definition of someone who does evil is the person who thinks that he is completely and wholly good. That self-righteousness is itself a kind of evil. And what happens with love is that love disrupts the fundamental coordinates by which you determine and judge the world. Love teaches you something not just about the world, but about yourself. And so Miyazaki says that one of the most important parts of his films is staging this encounter, this moment in which two people meet, and it's not necessarily that they have experiencing love at first sight. It's that everything else that they see suddenly appears to be different. And so it's not an infatuation, it's not a narcissistic attachment to the idea of what life might be like if you were with that person. Instead, it's specifically about saying, I've encountered somebody who is so other that now I have become an other to myself. It's an alienating experience of love, and this is why Miyazaki's theory of love is quite interesting. Because we usually think of love as a manner in which we become more true to ourselves, that we explore the depths of our own feelings more intimately because of love. And Miyazaki posits almost the exact opposite. He says that love begins as a disruptive force, as a seemingly alienating encounter that throws you into this kind of abyss of somebody else's consciousness. And the curiosity and the titillation that you experience by wanting to explore the world through their eyes means that you no longer see the world in the manner in which you saw it before. Now, this relates to, I came across this somewhere that the Basque word for love is actually to be wounded by love. And I love that idea, right? Because we think of love as something where you could get hurt, as in like someone no longer loves you, or they betray you, they cheat on you, or something like this. Like, love is a risky proposition because you risk it all. The stakes are high. And so because you are so vulnerable to the other person, you could be hurt. And yet there's also an element in which love itself is a kind of wound, that the process of falling in love can be a painful experience, and yet almost like a blissfully painful experience. This is what I talked about last week, that the reason we call it falling in love is because you're basically going through your day-to-day life and suddenly love happens to you, and it's like slipping on a banana peel as everything is upside down, and it happens so fast that you didn't even know what hit you. And that's essentially what love is. Love is not a slow, calculated process. It's like when Plato said that love is like a song that somebody else sings that only you can hear. That's essentially how love functions. And I find there's something also very comforting about this, because Plato says that if you are in a situation of unrequited love, in which you love someone but they don't love you back, then it simply means that they weren't ready for your song. And this idea that we exude a kind of core within our being, call it a song, call it essence, call it the common spiritual connection that all human beings share, call it pheromones, and that we send these signals out to the world and that they can be reciprocated, I find quite beautiful. But at the same time, like anything beautiful, there's a dangerous core underneath. The idea that the signal that you're sending might also be a lure, that you are drawing someone into the trap of love. And so when you fall in love, there's always an element of risk. And within the act of falling in love, there is already a kind of wound, because the person you were before has been wounded. You can't simply go on as you were before, pretending like you're not in love, like you haven't had this encounter. The encounter with someone else that triggers love in you almost demands of you a subjective act of will, stepping into this breach and saying, I want to know what the world is like with you. I want to see the world through your eyes. There's actually a really interesting example of this, falling in love. And it comes from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Tolstoy has this great line where he says that originally Anna Karenina was not supposed to be the main character of the novel. She was supposed to be a side character. And Tolstoy said that he had this profound experience in writing the novel, that when Anna Karenina first steps off the train, that Tolstoy fell madly in love with her, that he fell in love with his own character, that he had breathed life into this creation on the page. And that once he wrote Karenina, when she appeared on the page stepping off the steam train, he knew that the rest of the novel had to be about her. And I really do think that that's how love happens, right? Is that love is like you've created the situation in which suddenly there's an encounter with something that radically changes your point of view. Tolstoy's writing this novel, and there's this woman in the novel that he's created that he wants to be simply a side character, and yet his own encounter with his own creation forces him into a radically new act of creation, which is the novel Anna Karenina. And I love this idea that rather than writing a book about Anna, that it was Tolstoy himself who accidentally fell in love with his own creation and thereby created the novel. In other words, the novel happened to him. It was a revelation that came to him through the act of writing itself. And what better metaphor could there be for love than a process of revelation through the act of stepping into the subjective breach, which is your own creative consciousness? That's exactly what love is. And so love isn't something that happens to you, but it also requires a certain subjective embrace of that which is happening to you. It's not like you're forced to love somebody. You can fall in love or have a crush, and you can put it aside. You can put it into a mental drawer and say, this is not happening right now. This is also why the philosopher Alain Badiou says that love is a truth event. Oh, that was the ring light. Thank you. Thank you for our production assistant. We have trains in the background. That's probably what happened.
I think you've lost the phone.
That was a great catch, by the way.
Yeah.
That would have been really funny if I'd been hit over the head by our own ring light. This is the first time we've ever used a ring light, so that's an experiment. Last week, our tutorial was watched by more people than ever before. And so we wanted to hopefully respect your eyeballs by making the lighting actually not suck. Okay, so transition. Alain Badiou, philosopher, has this idea that love is a truth event. Now, without getting into the details of what he means by the event, which we can do in another class, essentially what Badiou means is that love is something that happens to you that reveals a kind of truth to you. It is what he calls a truth procedure. Now, this functions on two levels. On the one hand, it's a truth procedure because it really reveals a truth about you. I think most of us can relate to this, that when you fall in love with somebody, especially if you're in a relationship with somebody, you learn more about yourself by means of learning about them. It's like the ultimate vehicle of becoming more transparent to yourself is seeing yourself reflected back to you through the eyes of your lover. And so falling in love is a truth event because it essentially suggests an encounter with yourself through the other. Now, of course, this immediately sounds like a kind of narcissistic attachment. So we have to also point out that the inverse is true. That love is not only how you reveal yourself to yourself, love is also how the world reveals itself to you. This is a key distinction. When you're in love, it's not that you're blind, it's that you're bound. This means that through the process of being bound to somebody else's point of view, having an attachment and an ethical commitment to them, you start seeing the world in a different way. And so the paradox of love is precisely that you start becoming your own true self, more you than you were before, precisely by joining somebody else and seeing the world in a radically new way. And so for Badiou, what makes love a truth event is not only that it happens to you, but that it requires a subjective act of stepping into that gap. Saying, I will enact a minimal amount of my will to essentially see what this yields. That's the uncertainty of love, right? This is even true in the seduction stage. When you're in the process of seducing someone, there's a very strange paradox that occurs, which is that if the quote-unquote seduction is quote-unquote successful, it retroactively appears to you as if no seduction was needed, right? It's like the famous line, "You had me at hello." Well, you can't have someone at hello. That would be like a magic potion, a spell, purely manipulative. Instead, if there's a click, if there's a psychological compatibility between two people, and you've been flirting and dating and whatever, and you've fallen in love, and you are now in a relationship, it retroactively appears to you as if you were always meant to be. And this particular manner in which a purely contingent event, namely your encounter with somebody else, retroactively appears to you as a necessity, namely as your fate or destiny, that's precisely what Alain Badiou calls the encounter or the truth event of love. It's the process by which something completely accidental retroactively turns out to feel as if it was meant to be. And so it's the very process of quote-unquote successfully seducing someone, of, in a sense, convincing them to be with you by means of not convincing them, right? By means of allowing them to intuit that they would like to be with you, whereby retroactively they say, well, you didn't even need to seduce me. You already had me at hello. And this is essentially what Zizek calls retroactive causality. Retroactive causality is one of the key features of love. It's also what makes love seem so inexplicable. It's the idea that when you are in a relationship with somebody, it's very hard to imagine not having met that person. And the reason that it's so hard to imagine not having met that person is precisely because you have now entered a different subjective point of view. You see the world differently. You simply are no longer the person you were before. Now, if you go back to the Platonic idea that love is a song that only the other person can hear, something similar happens when it comes to loss of love. There's a beautiful line in the opening of Norwegian Wood, a Murakami novel, where he hears a Beatles song on the airplane, and the Beatles song sends him right back to his original love. He essentially has a Proustian moment where a contingent encounter with a fraction of a memory, for Proust it's a smell, for Murakami it's a song, takes them back to another time, which of course is another self. Because that's what love does. Love essentially brackets off your experience into this new chapter of your life in which you see and experience everything differently. And so if you've gone through the painful process of losing love, it means you're going through the painful process of having to become someone new. It means that you have multiple other selves that are buried within you that can be triggered at any one moment. And that's precisely the process of melancholy. Remember, this is something we talked about last week, that melancholy isn't just holding on to your own pain. It's realizing that within you, there are elements and nuggets of pain that have been buried that can come out and be triggered again. This is because when you're in love, not only do you change, but everything around you changes. Everything becomes imbued with a new weight, a new meaning, a new importance. It's like when you share something with somebody, it can be completely contingent. It can be dumb as like a shared look or a shared book or a favorite recipe or a line in a movie that makes you laugh. It becomes an in-joke. Because what else is a relationship if not a cosmic in-joke that you share with the other person? A kind of intimacy and understanding that only makes sense between the two of you. A kind of code, a shared language that allows you guys to communicate as if you were one soul. And of course, if you go through a breakup, that's what's so painful, is the rupturing of that unity and trying to constitute a new identity beyond that moment that you had of blissful dualism. Now, this is also why, and I want to focus a little bit more on this, the act of falling in love is something which requires subjective courage. And it's a paradox, isn't it? Because when you fall in love, it happens to you. Like Miyazaki said, it's an encounter. You suddenly have this moment of awareness of some other self. And yet, to actually embrace that, to be willing to undergo a moment of transformation or the possibility of being refuted, the possibility of landing in a situation of unrequited love, is itself a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, you're messing with the most precious thing to you, which is your subjective experience of the world. And so I really want to stress that love requires courage, which is another way of saying that love requires trust. Because trust is none other than courage rendered absolute. And what I mean by that is that the process of saying I trust you, like in Disney's Aladdin, when Aladdin reaches out and asks for Jasmine's hand, is precisely to risk that fall into the other person's strength. And that's what can make love seem very blissful, is that ironically and paradoxically, we find our most strongest subjective self precisely in the experience of allowing ourselves to fall into the arms of somebody else. To say, I believe that I can become my fullest true self by falling into you. And yet, the caution that we have to raise here is that if you think that you cannot be yourself unless you are with somebody else, then it means that you think you need them. And this is Erich Fromm's definition of love. I made a video about this yesterday. Erich Fromm says that there's a difference between mature love and immature love. Mature love says, I love you because I need you. Immature love says, I need you because I love you. I think I got them the wrong way around for dramatic effect. Okay. Erich Fromm says, immature love is saying, I love you because I need you. Mature love is saying, I need you because I love you. Now, what's the difference? When you say, I need you because I love you, mature love, you're essentially saying, I have a love for you, which goes beyond a moment of passion. It's a commitment. It's a long-term dream that I share with you. We have the third thing, the thing that binds us together. This means I've gone from what is essentially a fall into love towards an ethical commitment towards you. And this is what makes a long-term, quote-unquote, happy relationship, according to, for example, Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir says that equality within love is the highest feat. Now, equality within love doesn't mean that you're doing the same thing. It doesn't mean that you have a rota on which you cook on Mondays and she cooks on Tuesdays. Equality in love is the equality of enabling each other. In other words, of creating audacity for the other person. That if they're afraid to fail, they should never be afraid to fail to you. Because you're already keeping up appearances for the world, so why would you have to keep up appearances for your partner? And so the idea of equality for Simone de Beauvoir, which we call authentic love, is precisely this mutual, reciprocal process by which you bring out the best in somebody else on the condition that they bring out the best in you. And what's funny here is that there's also a political angle here, because this is essentially the whole Marxist take on love, which is essentially the idea that you should live in a society in which the things that you do elevate everybody else and vice versa. That your gains shouldn't come at the cost of somebody else's loss. And that's not what a relationship should be, right? In a relationship, there's no such thing as winning an argument. Even if you think you've won an argument, you've lost because you've undermined that fundamental unity and equality. And so within a relationship, you can only win if your partner is also winning. You can only advance if your partner benefits as well. And so Simone de Beauvoir, who certainly in her own life and her relationship with Sartre didn't have this experience necessarily, not always, hence also why she has such delicate insight into it, she was able to say that a sign of mature love, as Erich Fromm puts it, or for her, a sign of authentic love, is precisely the sign of reciprocity within love. Saying that love can be a vehicle for the emancipation of the self on the precondition that it is also the emancipation of the other, who is your partner. And that's also precisely the mirror of love and how love can reveal you to yourself. When you see yourself reflected back to you through the eyes of your partner, and that is a loving gaze, it is easier to love yourself. But here we have to go back to the trap that I mentioned before, which is that you can't go into a relationship if you think that the other person will complete you. If you are not capable of loving yourself, as the truism goes, you should not be in a relationship. This is also because if you think that the other person completes you, then you've misunderstood the fundamental goal and purpose of a relationship, which is not for the other person to complete you, but for the other person to accept you. Because if you have accepted yourself, then you can say, I am not going to change for you. I want to change with you. There's a fundamental difference between saying, I will change myself for you versus I am willing to undergo the process of change with you. Because that's what love is. It's a subjective experience of undergoing fundamental change to the coordinates of who you thought you were and the person you thought you might want to be. And that's a good thing. It's a process of self-revelation, or as Descartes said within the Cartesian subject, a self-transparent subjectivity. We think that we know the most about ourselves when we're by ourselves, but the opposite is true. We only learn about ourselves when we have the courage to love others, who will then learn and teach us about ourselves in a manner that we could not. That's what love fundamentally is. It's a great line from the Austrian satirist Karl Kraus. He says that, I try not to meddle in my own business. And that's exactly what love is you're no longer meddling in your own business, you're meddling in your shared business, a purpose, longevity, the audacity of love. And so this also means, and Hannah Arendt has a great line about this. Hannah Arendt says that the beauty about love is that when two people are in love, they don't need the rest of the world. They become a world unto themselves. There's that kind of reciprocity of navel gazing that happens when you're in love, where suddenly the world doesn't seem to matter all that much. And yes, you might think that it's you against the world, but it's really because you are a world upon yourself. It's also why, from a completely different angle, much darker, Freud said that the most horrific idea, the most horrific thing, the most monstrous horror movie element is precisely what he called the couple, the idea of the couple. People who start looking alike and dressing alike and saying the same things and finishing each other's sandwiches, as it were. This is precisely what Freud cautions about the couple. This kind of enclosed, narcissistic, self-contained unity that only flatters itself. And yet Hannah Arendt also says that there's something very pleasurable to be had in this. That when a very clear sign of love with someone is that you don't need to be with other people. You are a world unto yourself. You feel like you could talk forever. You feel like you could exchange ideas together and laugh together and be up all night together. That's what it means to be in love. And so when you're in love, you have this insular experience by which you suddenly realize that you are a world unto yourself. And yet it's precisely not narcissism, because you are finding that enjoyment and satisfaction by falling into the embrace of the other person. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to mention here, which is that there's a great line. And it goes, love is blind, but lovers are not. What that means is that just because you're in love, it doesn't mean that you should excuse toxic behavior from the other person. But It does mean that you may have a subjective view that is differently from other people on what constitutes toxicity. This is one of the fundamental weird paradoxes about love, is that it's very hard to explain to somebody why you love someone. Why is it that person and not somebody else? Now, on the one hand, it's because you can't admit to yourself the contingency of your own encounter. Yes, it could have been someone else. The idea of the one is something that we tell ourselves retroactively because we find it hard to process that within the infinite multitude of other people, this is the one person we happen to meet. And so vice versa, when we're in love, we learn who that other person is. We're not blind. We're not under some kind of spell. When you're in love with somebody, you actually know that person better than anybody else. In fact, you probably know them better than they know themselves. And so love is blind, but a lover is not. A lover should be able to see through the other person, should be able to know them intimately, both the bad and the good. And I've said this before, but a sign of love is to say, I'm not in love with the idea of you. I haven't elevated you to a pedestal. I don't think that you are this like holy person who will fulfill my every need and wish and make me complete. It's the exact opposite. Love is to say, I see you for who you are. You don't need to pretend with me. You don't need to be another person for me. I actually like you just how you are. In fact, I like what you think are your deficiencies. I am one of those strange peoples who happens to be infatuated with the things that you find unlovable about yourself. And this is where we go back to Erich Fromm. Remember, we talked about mature love, saying, I need you because I love you. But immature love is the opposite, which is to say, I love you because I need you. When you say I love you because I need you, you've essentially made the other person perfect. You've elevated them to this ideal, which is not a love, that's a crush. And I've said this before, a crush is safe because a crush is never going to hurt you. And yet, if you take what is essentially a crush, which is falling in love with a fictional character, and you apply that to a real person, after all, for many people, falling in love with someone is simply a fictional character. You fall in love with the idea of somebody who you think they might become or might yet be. And then you're bound to be disappointed. Because if you fall in love in that manner, where you're asking them to complete you without actually having an insight into who they are, it means you don't have an insight into who you are. Because if love is an act of revelation, an encounter with an other that allows you to see yourself as other, by which, in a weird, paradoxical, dialectical way, you reveal yourself in your own truth, what Badiou called the truth event, then it is precisely the ultimate illusion and fundamental mistake to go into a relationship thinking that the other person is complete and that you are lacking. Because nothing could be less true. It is only when you know your own completeness that you can go through the crucible of love by which you give, as I said last week, that which you do not have to someone who does not want it. Namely, you take your lack, your experience of yourself as other in the eyes of the other's completeness, and you refract it back upon you, and you find yourself seen through their eyes. Abstract, but go back to last week and you'll see what we talked about there. Okay, so I want to wrap up on a couple of things, which is I want to talk a little bit about flirtation and flirting. There's this weird thing that I think happens to a lot of people where flirting almost seems to induce love. And then they ask themselves, well, is it really love? Because I fall in love with anybody who flirts with me. And this can be a very tricky thing to figure out. Because if somebody flirts with you, then you presume that they're interested. But then you think, well, maybe I'm being manipulated. And so you think, is it real love, or have I just fallen for you because you are flirtatious? It's a double bind that we can very easily fall into. Now, this has to do with a very human sensibility, which is that we all think that we don't want to be fooled, and yet secretly we want to be fooled. This is what magicians know perfectly well, is that the reason that people are in the audience is because they want to be fooled. The audience is there because they want to believe. They're already primed. And yet they hold on to their own, let's say, like, reluctance. They have to be convinced to let down their guard. And so what happens when someone is flirting with you in a very deliberate way is that your guard actually goes up. You think to yourself, well, you're flirting with me and I don't want to fall for this. And yet secretly you do want to fall for it. I think a lot of people identify within themselves that one of their weaknesses is that they will simply fall in love with anybody who flirts with them. But of course, this raises an impossible problem, which is if you're not allowing yourself to fall in love with anybody who flirts with you, how do you fall in love? Is love simply supposed to hit you like a thunderbolt out of the sky? And so often we end up chasing people who aren't flirting with us because we think, well, if flirtation is manipulative and I don't want to fall in love with someone who flirts with me, then I'm going to fall in love with someone who doesn't flirt with me, which means you end up falling in love with somebody not because they want you, but because you think that they are the object that you cannot have. In other words, you still have a fetishistic attachment to that person because you simply think this person is out of my reach, thereby I love them. And that's how so many people end up in this weird friend zone, which is that you end up wanting them more precisely because they're not flirting with you. And so you start reading too much into every interaction. But of course, this indeterminacy is itself what flirtation is. Because true flirting isn't saying, look at me, I smell good. True flirting is the accidental touch. True flirting is saying, we were walking together and suddenly our hands touched. And does this mean something or not? Flirtation is flirtation precisely because it is indeterminate. And it is asking for that subjective act of will, walking into the breach. There's always a moment within any process of falling in love in which you have to make the active choice to fall into love. This is one of those fundamental misconceptions that people have about love, that it simply happens to you, that it's like once you meet somebody, you know, and that it's over. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, we fall into love. We're wounded by love. And at the same time, there's a subjective decision, an act that is required on behalf of you to say, I will step into this breach. And of course, this is dangerous because as soon as you've subjectively chosen to act, whether it's to seduce someone or to spend time with them or to talk with them or slide into their DMs or whatever, you've already put your finger on the scale of love. You've already admitted that love is something that isn't just going to happen to you, but that you have to make happen. And as soon as you decide that you have to make love happen, then you start wondering to yourself, well, is it real? And so the process of doubt that you start internalizing as to whether or not your love is real starts at the exact moment that you have to actualize your love. You act upon it. But this is the crucial part of going from a crush to actual love. Because as I said before, crush is essentially abstract. Crush are like training wheels for love. Crush is the idea of love without requiring the subjective act of stepping into the breach of love. This is also why you can have an encounter with somebody, but if you elevate it to the level of the crush, then you've not learned anything about yourself. Because a crush isn't about learning about who you are. A crush is about learning everything about who the other person is. A crush in that sense isn't just safe, it requires a distance. What people don't realize, and this is something that Lacan wrote about with fetishistic disavowal, a crush, rather than being the way to get to the object of your desire, is in fact the very barrier. A crush says, secretly, I don't want to be with this person. Secretly, I don't think I'm ready. Secretly, I don't want to actually risk losing it all. I just want to have this. I want to hold on to my idea of that person. I want to have the crush. I want to cradle it. This is my fetishistic attachment to the idea of who you are so that I never have to be confronted with the reality of who you are. Now, this is not a bad thing. I'm not judging it. In fact, it can be very good and educational, and you can explore the depths of your own love. Stephen Fry, who I already quoted last week, English actor and essayist, he said that all first love is unrequited. It always goes unrequited because all first love starts as a crush. All first love is a seemingly impossible infatuation with an ideal that you cannot reach, whether it's someone in a musical group, whether it's someone on TV, whether it's even like a fictional character, like in a book or an anime. All love starts like this. Tolstoy's love for Anna Karenina wasn't love, it was a crush. He basically developed a massive crush on his own character and wrote an entire book as an ode to her. And so a crush can be productive, it can be something that stimulates you. But a crush isn't the same thing as love. A crush is something that you control. You don't have to subjectively fall into it. You don't see yourself as your own other through the process of a crush. A crush is something where you actually accumulate a lot of data and knowledge on the other person, but you preserve the fantasy that you are the one who is in need of completing by the other. As soon as you're in a relationship, you realize that it's the exact other way around. When you're in a relationship, you realize that you are in fact the one who already was complete, but now you have to learn to see yourself through the eyes of somebody else. That's what love is. It's the illumination of your own subjectivity from a different angle, under a different light. Because what could be more bright than a relationship that illuminates you from all these angles that you've never seen before? All right, now I want to end briefly, because there's more we can do, but we're going to do this next time, which is that I believe very strongly that the manner in which you encounter love is precisely by not trying to encounter it. This is something that I don't want to like give advice to people, but I do want to say that the best way to fall in love is to not go looking for love. And that can seem painful and contradictory because we all know that if we don't look for what we want, we'll never get it. No one's gonna give me a milkshake just because I visualize a milkshake. You can't manifest love. You can't sit at home imagining Prince Charming and then Prince Charming will show up. I mean, maybe, but unlikely. And yet, being ready for love requires two things. It requires being confident that you don't need love, right? Which is the first super important thing. As soon as you are confident that you don't need love, it means that you are ready for love. Now, that's very different from acting in defiance of love. Some people confuse this. They become arrogant. They say, well, I'm so afraid of not finding love that I'm going to pretend like love is something that I don't need. Love is like a condiment to life that I have rejected. I'm not going to mess with it. I don't want to get sticky fingers. And so some people say, well, I despise love. I don't need it. Love is terrible. And they think that that's strength. But of course, it's a kind of weakness. It's saying, I have to hold on so securely to my sense of self that I can't risk allowing it to fall into the grasp of somebody else. Remember I said before, love requires courage because love requires trust. And what else is trust than saying, I rescind some of my own autonomy, some of my power, and I give it to you. Do with it as you like. You may abuse your power, but I give it to you. And there's something very important about that because even if within like a Christian perspective, the whole point of being free is learning to be subject to somebody else. This is the Christian idea of love, agape. It's not just unconditional love. It's not just saying you should show the other cheek. It's specifically saying that there's a paradoxical, as Zizek said before, right? I mentioned this retroactive process of love by which the very unfreedom that you experience in love, by means of saying, I am now not just my own self, I am someone who is bonded to you, makes you more free, makes you more liberated. The weird, strange paradox of love is that it's precisely by limiting yourself, restricting yourself, becoming subject to somebody else, that you find your own freedom and you experience yourself as an autonomous being. Which isn't to say that you can't be free without love, but it's saying that once you no longer need love, it means you can have the courage to say, I subject myself to you and I subject myself to my higher goal, my higher freedom. But we'll get back to that in another class. And so as Badiou says, love is a disclosure. It's a disclosure of a truth event. It's a disclosure about a truth about you and a truth about the other person, which when brought together, reveals itself to you as a disclosure about the world itself. And this is also why, again, I said love is not blind. Love is blind, but lovers are not blind. Which is that love happens to you. It's like a blinding flash in which suddenly everything appears differently to you. But you as a lover are not blind. You start seeing the world differently. You start inhabiting your life world in a manner that is elevated, that is inflamed, that is more attuned, more sensitive. There's a reason that when we're in love, we hear songs differently, we watch movies differently, we become a raw nerve to the world. And so love is precisely that process of saying, I can actually be subject to the world, to the fullest extent of what it means to experience human emotion. I think that's super important. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Jalene's stomach just gurgled like so loud. So I wanna end on something. Well, actually, we should probably do this next week because I realize we've already gone pretty long. But I want to end on this idea. I said there are two ways that you can know whether you are ready for love. First, I said, a precondition for falling in love is not needing it. And this is kind of painful, right? Because if you don't need love, well, why would you have it? It's like, why is it that you are only ready for love when you don't think you need it? Well, it's quite simple. Because it's something that Dostoevsky already wrote. Love isn't about finding someone who will complete you. Love is about finding someone who will accept you. The problem is that if you're looking for someone who will complete you, it means you haven't accepted yourself. And so you idolize the other person. But once you accept yourself, you're ready to be accepted by somebody else. But this is also about reciprocity. Because you can't actually be capable of loving somebody and accepting them if you are still wondering that they have to be perfect about you. Think about it. Nobody wants to be in love with an ideal. Because if you're in love with an ideal, how are they ever going to live up to that? If the whole point of a relationship is consolidating a kind of originating passion into a long-lasting commitment, you can't have a long-lasting commitment to an ideal. You would simply become like this perverted fundamentalist. Everything I do is for you. You can't say everything I do is for you. Instead, you have to say everything I do is for us. As soon as you realize that it's not you versus me, that it's us, you have a different perspective on who you are by means of being with that other person. This is also, again, why I said that Freud said that the couple is the most scary thing. A couple are two people who start thinking as one person. They start acting as one person. Their motivations and their goals and ambitions start to align. And yet, as Hannah Arendt said, there's something very powerful in this. Something solipsistic that actually nurtures what the experience of life is. Because one of the fundamental difficulties of being alive, especially when you're alone, is that life is simply the succession of one thing after another. That time and your temporal experience becomes, I am simply going through the motions, looking for that which I think will satisfy me. And that's perfectly fine. And you can, I saw this clip online, which is a guy who says that he really resented falling in love because it's terrible for his productivity. And yes, that's exactly true. Love is not a productivity enhancer. Love is revolutionary in that it will suddenly shatter the incentive structure that you had before, by which what you thought was important suddenly reveals itself as having been simply a coping mechanism to get to through the daily grind. Love suddenly makes that seem not so important. And so yes, love is threatening in that way, because love, if it's true love, will shatter your previous worldview. Your worldview now becomes a shared worldview. And so you want to enjoy things together. And you enjoy them more together. Think about one of the hardest things about going through a breakup is that a lot of things that you did now remind you of that person. Whether it's going to a movie or being in a bookstore or even like, I don't know, making a certain recipe or hearing a certain song. What was once a celebration has now become a kind of tombstone to your relationship, a marker of that which you have lost, that which you are still mourning and you now carry within you. And so love, because we started on this, love as an encounter, love is also a temporal disruption. And this is why Miyazaki uses love specifically within his movies as a staging device for a narrative shift. Because one of the things that Miyazaki has argued, Hayao Miyazaki, the animator and director, is that what he dislikes about anime is that anime distorts time. And the reason anime distorts time is simply because it's easier to animate. You need less frames. For example, a baseball anime, you will have an entire episode that takes place between the pitcher throwing the ball and the batter hitting it. And we have lots of flashbacks and dramatic exposition. And the slowing down of time for dramatic effect. You could watch Dragon Ball Z and 50 episodes will go by and they still haven't punched each other. This is the whole point of anime, is to distort and tease out time to retain your attention. Miyazaki has a very different theory of time. Miyazaki says that time is something very subjective. Time isn't just happening to you. Time is about how you step into your own life. And so one of the things that Miyazaki does is that when he stages love, not as like the coming together of two souls who were predestined to meet, but instead as a disruptive encounter with someone who's so fundamentally alien to you that now you become alien to yourself. He's making a temporal claim. Time stops when you fall in love. And if time stops, then it means that you have to figure out how to get the clock ticking again. And getting the clock ticking again is something that you do together, because what does a clock have? It has two hands, the hours and the minutes. And once you find that out, that you have combined yourself with the other person, now time starts working again for you. But the love encounter is a moment of paralysis. It's a moment of radical disruption. It's not a comfortable thing to fall in love. This is why love wounds us before we've even been wounded by the other. And yet it's precisely as in Parsifal, Wagner's Parsifal, Die Wunde heilt nur der Speer, der sie schlug, which Hegel writes about as well when it comes to the contingency of necessity. The idea being that the wound can only be closed by that which smote it. And so the very thing that pierced you, that took you out of the revelry, which was what you thought what your daily life was, your daily grind, suddenly is radically opened up. And it comes gushing out, and it's painful and it's disruptive. And yet you realize that the only thing that can stop the bleeding is the very thing that caused it. And so you have to suture the wound. And the only way to suture the wound is to walk into that gap. Walk into the breach, which is love. And of course you could be hurt. You could be even more hurt. And then you have a scar. But at the same time, this is the entire idea that Badiou has about love as a truth event. Love is something that appears to you as a wound, as a radical disruption into the very core of your being. And it asks and demands of you that you step into that gap and you find your own subjective self by means of risking it all and falling into the so-called Nietzschean abyss. And that's what love is. Love isn't just roses and beautiful and the kind of thing that like makes you want to go and buy more merchandise and eat hamburgers. Remember McDonald's slogan, I'm loving it? Love is precisely not loving it. Love is saying, now my hamburger tastes like ash in my mouth because I want to be with you. And that's not a comfortable experience. And yet it's precisely that particular ethical moment of complete disruption of what you thought was your equilibrium, which is the precondition to stepping into a higher form of consciousness, which is the whole point of love, which is also why Badiou then elevates the idea of love to a very principle of revelation of truth as such. If truth is the metaphysical ideal, the essence, the pure form, the light outside of the Platonic cave, then love is a vehicle of finding that truth, of stepping outside of your own shell and being able to look at yourself from an impossible distance, which is the distance of somebody else's love and affection for you. And of course that's terrifying, and of course it's scary, and it requires courage and trust, because it means that you have to acknowledge that your truth may not actually be with you a priori, an sich. That finding and identifying who you really are may actually require, paradoxically, a complete dismantling of who you thought you were. And it's that productive process of dismantling yourself on behalf of the other with somebody else and creating a life that is more than just 1 + 1. Remember the line, love is when 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, 1 + 1 = 1. That higher one of love is precisely a revelatory process by which you realize that the true secret was that there is no secret. That love is something that reveals itself to you as its own secret, as something that creates a gap within the logic structure and the incentive structure that you experience on a day-to-day basis and demands of you that you step into it. And that's precisely how you raise love from not just a subjective experience, but to the metaphysical idea of agape, of unconditional love. As I said before, unconditional love isn't saying I love you no matter what. That would be ridiculous. That would be to idealize the other person. That would be to go back to the idea of a crush, an abstraction, a fictional image of who that is. And yet all love is falling in love with a fictional character. And the kind of fictional character that you're falling in love with is not the fictional character of who the other person is, but who you might become with them. And so agape as love is not unconditional love because they can do anything to you and you put up with it. It's unconditional love because it is detached from the incentive structure, the conditionality by which you had ordered the logic of your pre-existing life. And when you enter into that void, it means that you are entering into a revolutionary space. A revolution is never saying, I'm going to fight against something. I'm going to fight against what something was. A revolution is to create the gap from which an imminence of a new imagination can emerge. And that new imagination, that which is not as of yet new, but will become an inevitable fate, what Zizek calls the retroactive contingency of the necessity of love, that is the emancipatory revolutionary potential of love as the absolute. And so we find refracted within our own subjective experience of love, which can seem very small between two people looking at each other and suddenly having a fundamentally different experience of what life is. We find within that the reflection of a higher form of the unfolding of love and what Hegel called spirit. But more of that next week. All right, guys, thank you so much. I hope that you have enjoyed this. I am so blessed and so happy that we have so many people watching this. We have like more than 100 people like in the live stream, which is just crazy. So thank you guys so much. Thank you guys for joining us for this tutorial on love and how to find it. This was episode 2, the encounter, the traumatic encounter with the other who contains the key towards you. We're gonna be posting this for free, open access on Instagram and YouTube. But if you would like to download the entire series, please do head over to my Patreon, because that's how I basically finance this project. I want to keep talking about this. I want to keep preaching it. And if you'd like to support this project, if you'd like to download all the classes and get exclusive access to the transcripts, the Discord, the ebook, please do take a look at the Patreon. Makes a huge difference. It's www.patreon.com/JenLeneandJulian, or simply click the link in my bio. On that note, I also want to say that we've just released the ebook for the previous lecture series, which was an introduction to Lacan and Zizek. That book is called The Useless Precaution. Literally came out this morning. And if you are a patron, you can now go to Patreon and download the ebook called The Useless Precaution. Most of all, I'm so grateful that you've joined me here today. This was wonderful. I'm so grateful to be sharing my passion with you guys. And hopefully it's been valuable and enriching to you. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Or you could join us in 5 minutes for the bonus Q&A, which we record live on Discord. So if you want to ask a question about love and how to find it, head over to the Discord, which is part of our $5 tier on Patreon, and you can ask me any question you want, and we will record it for your listening pleasure. All right. Thank you guys so much. I love you all, and I will see you next week.